I guess it's time. Welcome everyone to the second session of the regional panel series presented by the European Centre of Populist Studies. My name is Northwood, an intern. First of all, with your permission, as Samir mentioned, this panel will be recorded and broadcast on YouTube. So assuming that you're still in the room, we have your consent to record and broadcast this later. Thank you so much. The ECPS curates these monthly sessions in addition to monthly panel series titled Mapping Global Populism. These series are aimed at discussing the diverse manifestations of populism across the world. Following the successful conclusion of our Mapping European Populist panels, we decided to embark on the journey to explore populism beyond the confines of Europe by expanding our panel series to encompass a global perspective. Our objective is to construct a comprehensive understanding of populism worldwide through these monthly and periodical sessions. In today's session, however, we will examine the crisis of democratic political legitimacy and emergence of populism in Africa, a crucially understudied field. As a testament to our commitment to knowledge dissemination, we are going to write a panel report along with sharing the video of this panel on our YouTube channel and our website. If you have not done so, please go like and subscribe our YouTube channel. The panel itself, along with the reports we publish after each panel, are invaluable resources for scholars, policymakers, along with the wider audience who are concerned about the contemporary challenge posed to democracy by populist actors and authoritarian politics. In this ongoing journey, our panel series, we extend our deepest gratitude to the scholars and experts who have contributed and continue to contribute their invaluable insights. With this, I would like to introduce our esteemed moderator for today's session, Dr. Chipo Dendere, who will present the panelists, their subjects, and after this, administer the panel. Dr. Dendere is a Zimbabwean-born scholar of political science. She studies the factors that influence policy survival and democratization in the developing world. As an assistant professor of African studies at Wellesley College in Massachusetts, she teaches a course on African politics and democratization in the developing world. She has earned a PhD in political science in 2015 at the Georgia State University under the supervision of Dr. Daniel Young. Her doctoral dissertation and subsequent book manuscript that she's working on right now is how both her exit via immigration and withdrawal from politics impacts the survival of dominant parties. For this work, she interviewed Zimbabweans in 4 countries. Her new research is on the relationship between African politics and social media in all its varieties, which is very interesting stuff, especially considering how Africa this year is having the most elections in a singular year. So thank you again, Dr. Dendere, for moderating. Thank you again to our panelists for appearing. Dr. Dendere, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Neo. Moving forward, we have a great set of panelists for you today. So I am just going to introduce people in the order that they appear on the program. So first is Dr. Henning Melber. He came to Namibia as a son of German immigrants in 1967, where he joined the anti-colonial movement SWAPO in 1974. He was director of the Namibian Economic Policy Research Unit in Windhoek, research director of the Nordic Institute, and director of the, I Googled this and I still cannot pronounce any German words or Nordic words, in Sweden. He is an extraordinary professor at the Department of Political Sciences, University of Pretoria, and the Center of Gender and Africa Studies, University of Free State in Bloemfontein, and a senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London. He's a trained journalist. He studied at the Vrije University in Berlin and obtained a PhD in political sciences and sociology at the University of Bremen. He has written extensively. His latest book is Understanding Namibia, The Trials of Independence, He's also an editor at various journals, and today he will speak on the various facets of populist, authoritarian, and nationalist trends in Africa. I thought it would make sense to introduce speakers as they're coming up instead of introducing everybody all at once. So Professor Melber, over to you. And I believe you have 10 minutes to speak.
Sorry, you are muted, Dr. Melber.
My apologies. That's the nervousness and the excitement to have the opportunity to interact with such a diversity of African scholars, which is really a great privilege for which I'm grateful. I started by saying that thank you, Dr. Dendere, by so meticulously listing all the titles, which underlines the point that indeed I'm as old as I'm looking. My task is to present a short overview on the subject of populism. And I would like to start by pointing at the fact that populism in politics is anything but a new invention and not confined to African realities. It exists in a variety of historical settings and societies, as well as ideological connotations in almost any part of the world. Beyond its particular substantive contents, if there are any substantive contents, populism operates with a specific kind of rhetoric, addressing in a simple and direct way the people. It creates the impression that it is them, the people, that would matter, that they count more than access to political power by those acting in a populist mode. Populist forms of mobilization are not necessarily, by definition, despotic or authoritarian. At times, they deliberately tend to promote liberal democracy, while being in their core utterly illiberal. This creates and testifies to a broad disparity between the propagated and claimed ideal and the reality, or between promises and deliveries. At a closer look, populists in most cases are mainly about their own interests, not as they claim about those of the people and wider society. That populism has received in recent times more attention might be a result of new communication technologies which enhance the operational space of populism. New media as propaganda instruments are a suitable tool for spreading populist messages, often deliberately including fake news. In African societies, the mixture of media and transmission of messages, however, might still rely, especially in rural areas, on personal appearances and forms of mobilization. This underlines another form and important element of populism, not only, but also in the African context. The leader or leaders who personify the populist policy and invite for identification with individuals in as much as with policy programs. Generally, there seems to be a close affinity between forms of populism and strong nationalist-oriented forms of government and governance. Populism, therefore, not by accident, is a widely shared phenomenon in African societies. following at times long battles for independence and state sovereignty, the fight for political self-determination cultivates strong nationalist tendencies as a substantial part of nation building. This occurs often in combination with individual rulers, symbolizing a big chief syndrome, leading dominant parties largely in control over public discourse and spheres. Witnessing the emergence of sovereign governments and their policies in West African states during the late 1950s, Frantz Fanon presented in 1961 a scathing criticism of the rule of self-declared liberators. And this is one of the first African critics of a form of populism. In chapter 3 of his manifesto, The Wretched of the Earth, he characterized the performances as the pitfalls of national consciousness. For Fanon, the new state, instead of conveying a sense of security, trust, and stability, foists itself on the people, using mistreatment, intimidation, and harassment as domesticating tools. The party in power, as Fanon states, I quote, controls the masses to remind them constantly that the government expects from them obedience and discipline. End of the quote. Not much has changed in the 64 years since then. The common engagement with populism tends to focus on the context of established democracies in which populists mobilize against an establishment and appeal to sentiments suspicious of those democrats in government, rallying against both the established structure of power and the dominant ideas and values of the society. The common assumption is that they are of the people, but not of the system. This form of attack on established systems is not the point of departure for the kind of populism we are witnessing, especially in Southern Africa, where current populist discourses rely on heroic narratives to create continued identification with the past to legitimize the present. While governments need more than only an electoral majority based on increasingly dubious numbers combined with a populist rhetoric, such appeals have been an integral part of post-settler colonial narratives in the region. They are a means to legitimize the continued governance of former liberation movements by appealing to the continued struggle against foreign domination and thereby marketing oneself as the only true alternative and promise of a better future. It is a kind of retrospectively applied populism vis-à-vis a colonial dominance. While this era of colonial dominance is formally left behind and replaced by a local government in a sovereign state, it remains accused of efforts to regain power. This justifies an ongoing struggle led by the former liberation movement as the sole legitimate authority to represent the people freed from the colonial oppression. Liberation movements as governments retain a movement character and often have more or less charismatic leaders, vivid individuals who can make politics personal and immediate instead of being remote and bureaucratic. But the times when leaders of the dominant parties could claim to be the alternative to the establishment are over. After all, they are the establishment. South Africa and the elections at the end of this month serve as a suitable example. The ANC's appeal to populist reminiscences of a bygone era of the struggle days has become increasingly less convincing. While populism continues to appeal to identification with the continued struggle against foreign domination, marketing oneself as the only true alternative and premise of a better future becomes increasingly shallow and hollow. It is a kind of retrospectively applied populism vis-à-vis a colonial dominance that has been replaced by a governing party perpetuating colonial features. The claim of an ongoing struggle led by the former liberation movement as the sole legitimate authority to represent the people freed from the colonial oppression is an effort of fending off any domestic political opposition. But the times when leaders of the dominant parties could claim to be the alternative to the establishment are over. They are, as already said, the establishment. As observed by the South African political analyst William Gumede, I quote, "African independence and liberation movements turned governments have often become obstacles to building lasting democracies. Their internal organizational cultures, leaders, and the way they exercise power have more often undermined democracy." End of the quote. This, however, and I'm soon ending, applies in the case of South Africa also to those who now shared the heroic narrative, but then decided, in pursuance of their own agendas, to mobilize in the disguise of presenting a new alternative, trying to seize power from the ANC as the declared cradle of their own ambitions and aspirations. They reproduce the pseudo-radical populism of those they are now challenging. The economic freedom fighters, EFF, of Julius Malema and the new Umkhonto weSizwe MK party of Jacob Zuma are birds of the same feather and no alternative to the ANC. They are more of the same and most likely far more dangerous. They are a visible indication that populism is alive and kicking. To end, I am grateful for the opportunity to benefit, like all of you in attendance, from listening to the 5 presentations of African scholars following and their nuanced engagements with a variety of features, forms, and consequences of populism in an African context. I thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That was very timely. And you have raised many important points, starting with that linking populism perhaps to the origins of democracy on the continent, but showing us where there have been a divergence between the idea of populism originating for fighting for independence and what we're seeing now. But without further ado, let me introduce our next speaker, Dr. Nchofua Anita Nyitioseh, who is a lecturer at the University of Bertoua within the Faculty of Law and Political Science, specifically in the Department of English Law. Additionally, she holds a part-time position at the University Institute of Leaders Dole in the Institutes of Justin ISIG, where she contributes to the Department of Transport and Logistics. Recently, she participated in research writing workshop organized by the Marian Institute for Advanced Studies in Africa, College of Humanities at the University of Ghana. She's also a jurist and corporate law specialist with expertise in alternative dispute resolution mechanisms under the OHADA law. She earned her PhD in Director's Duties and Protection of Stakeholders under OHADA and English Corporate Law from the University of Chiang, Faculty of Law and Political Science, Department of English Law. Her academic journey includes completing a master's and bachelor's degree in law from the same institution. Furthermore, she's actively engaged in research focusing on various aspects such as alternative dispute resolution, consumer protection, green energy transition, and climate change in Africa, particularly in Cameroon. Today, the title of her talk is Democratizing Africa, Navigating Populist Trends, Building Trust in Institutions, and Promoting Stability through Inclusive Governance. Welcome, Professor. I thought I saw her coming in, but she might have been kicked out because I know people have been having challenges with internet. Shall I go to the next speaker and then we'll come back?
I think that makes the most sense. Thank you. Yeah,
because I think Professor Sergiu is here, right?
Hmm?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I will skip over to our next speaker and then we can come back. As you know, for those of us who are based on the continent, well, in South Africa, we've been lucky, no load shedding because of elections coming up. But I'm sure once elections are done, we'll be back to 16 hours of load shedding or whatever awaits us. So Dr. Sergiu Mișcoiu is a Romanian researcher and professor of political science at the Faculty of European Studies, Babeș-Bolyai University. He also serves as the director of the Center on International Cooperation and the director of the Center for African Studies. Additionally, he's a permanent member of the Political Studies Institute at the University of Paris, where he has been a PhD tutor since 2010 and an associate professor since 2007. Over the course of his career, he has authored 4 books, edited or co-edited 20 volumes, and contributed to 61 collective volumes and 56 scientific articles. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Paris East, another PhD in history from Babeș-Bolyai University, and a habilitation in political science from Paris East. He also served as a guest professor at several universities, including Paris East, including Nantes and Bordeaux in France, Warwick, Bogota in Colombia, Marrakesh in Morocco, Yaoundé in Cameroon, Dakar in Senegal, and Abomey Calavi in Benin, where he co-founded the country's first PhD school in political science in 2017. Like many people on our panel, he has received many awards for his academic achievements, including the Paris Thesis Prize in 2007, the Annual Research Prize in 2015 and 2020, and another prize from the French government in 2012. The title of his talk today is Taming the Lion, on the conditions of possibility of a progressive populism in Sub-Saharan Africa. Welcome to Dr. Sergiu Mișcoiu. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dendere. Thank you very much, Nyitioseh, for the invitation also to join the panel. I'm sure that the discussions will be also very, very interesting. And without further ado, because time is a factor, I will get into the content of my presentation. So I would like today to discuss about the hypothesis of positive, progressive populism in Africa, and about the conditions of possibility of such a hypothesis. And to introduce the subject, as we already know, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and it was said by Professor Melber, the contestation of the neo-colonial elite-based regimes took place in the name of full national popular sovereignty as an ideal, but lots of populist movements in Sub-Saharan Africa had an authoritarian or even a totalitarian component, from Marxist-Leninism pushed to an edge to different ethno-religious forms of ultranationalism. So I think that the question is legitimate. Is a progressive populism possible in Sub-Saharan Africa? And what would be its articulatory form, its discursive content, and how would its main proponents emerge? Where would its main proponents emerge from? These are the main questions I would try to answer, of course, very rapidly, and of course without final say today. So I will first try to define populism, just to be coherent in the third point of my presentation about what I meant by populism. Then a brief incursion into the historical facets of populism in Sub-Saharan Africa, and then some thoughts about the conditions of possibility for a progressive populism in Sub-Saharan Africa, with a more concrete basis, which is qualitative field research I conducted with 89 interviews and 2 focus groups with Sub-Saharan African citizens. To start with the first point, defining populism, my take is from discourse theory, especially the work of scholars such as Ernesto Laclau, Chantal Mouffe, or Jacques Rancière. And in different contributions, I try to show that populism could be rather defined not as an ideology, but rather as a discursive register having a hegemonic vocation and based on 2 different issues. On one hand, on the exaltation of the popular identification, the people identified as such, and this is underlined by the populists, and that is operated through some sort of an ideological still articulation of the characteristics of the people. And then, on the other hand, on the exclusion of the guilty other, of the otherness, and the common denominator of these others is the fact that they fight for depriving the people of a fulfillment of their popular identity. So to sum up in this drawing, populism is based on this us versus them separation with a thick line in the middle. The people, which should be in some sort of a conjunction with the populist leaders, parties, intellectuals, people expressing demands such as justice, redistribution, morality, and so on. And on the other hand, the non-people, those who are not allowing the people to be itself, and this is according to each type of populism, made out of the elites, of the rich, of the foreigners, and of course of different minorities, ethnical, cultural, sexual, or other, who compose this non-people that is repressed in the populist discourse. Now, in Sub-Saharan Africa, we had an evolution of populism that was interesting to follow, to some extent different, but also with some similarities with other types of populism. In the 1950s, the first emancipatory anti-colonial platforms emulating the examples of India's Nehru or Egypt's Nasser. And in the 1960s, the wave of independences initially was leading to some societal enthusiasm, and unfortunately this turned into major disappointment because, of course, for the first time, people realized the difference between a de jure independence and the de facto independence, which was not one, and democracy was then sacrificed on the altar of the Cold War alignment with all the historical events that we know. For that reason, the development of the populist movements happened either under the form of a Marxist-Leninist anti-Western platform, or on the other hand, on an ethno-national anti-communist right-wing movement full of identitarianism, or some mixtures in between, leaders vacillating between the two forms of populism, trying to combine them in order to stay in power or to get to power. In the 1980s, unfortunately, the reinforcement of authoritarianism increased the popular contestation and mass repression, while the second wave of democratization in the 1990s, with the fall of the Eastern Bloc and of communism, was seen with enthusiasm, but once again, it led to a disappointment now because of new colonial support to authoritarian regimes, and moreover, also because of the multiplication of the domestic conflicts, including civil wars in many African countries. So the populist movements in Sub-Saharan Africa remained captured by autocratic leadership, and also these autocratic leaderships carried on their particular instrumental goals that could be synthesized in the famous formula, leave the seat so I can take it. It's my turn now to rule. Now, this could be also envisaged visually by this us versus them dichotomy, with the African people in a relation of symbiosis with the populist leaders, asking for real sovereignty, respect of identity, historical reparations, and other demands, and excluding the colonial and then neo-colonial powers and their allies, like the African white-like elites, the North-based holdings and corporations, the international organizations, the states and leaders who are puppets of the North, denounced as such, of course, and in most cases also the seceding ethnic or religious minorities, leading to conflicts. And this, of course, is very far from a progressive populism. Nevertheless, what is progressive populism? Well, I would say that progressive populism could be described as being the virtuous articulation of the popular identity, the demos, the political people, including all the formerly excluded individuals and groups, those who were oppressed, those who were marginal, or to use the expression of Rancière, the sans-voix, the sans-part. Now, the exclusion is there also because it is a populism, but it's not the exclusion of all the others, but the exclusion of those forces who prevent not only the unity of the people, but also its democratic consistency and the fact that the people is seen in a democratic way. So a progressive populism could be emancipatory, as it will aim the economic and political empowerment of the people, and also liberal democratic, in that it will establish a tolerant and inclusive participatory system of collective decision-making. Otherwise, it won't be progressive at all. So emancipatory and liberal democratic. We do have somehow, I would say, positive example in the recent events in Senegal, with Ousmane Sonko and Bassirou Diomaye Faye, who entertained a platform which was popular, thoroughly entrenched with elements of deliberative democracy, especially back in 2019, 2020, with elements of social and economic progressivism, and contesting at once elitism, corruption, stagnation, and also the neo-colonial dependency. Nevertheless, it was not really a progressive populism because the party PASTEF entertained ambiguity on cultural and societal emancipation, especially in terms of women's rights, entertained also clear moral and cultural conservatism and the discussion about the place of Islamic conferees within the view of the word of PASTEF is debated still. And then ambiguity in foreign policy, putting ahead the interests of Senegal as a state instead of the values defended by the Africans, including Pan-Africanism. So an example with some limits. And let's see in the end, that I will end by these examples, what came out of the inquiry conducted. So 89 interviews with individuals from 23 sub-Saharan African states. Of course, it's not representative from a statistical point of view, but that's not the point. It's rather important because of the diversity, I would say even the radical diversity of the people present in these interviews, and also the multi-criterial selection. The two focus groups, one in Benin and the other in Tanzania, with 18 participants, allowed me to go in depth into these elements and understand better the motivations of the participants to this research. The purpose was to understand what are the conditions for supporting a progressive populist movement as projected by these respondents. And I would rapidly go into the main conclusions of this investigation with some quotations. I won't have the time to enter into details, but you have them on screen. So there is first a mistrust in the existing leaders, and this is generalized as an answer. These leaders are kept in the pocket of the Westerners, as somebody from Burundi said. Secondly, most respondents would support any movement that could, I quote, improve the people's precarious material conditions. So any genuine movement should be built around the idea of, I quote again, removing the elites from power. The elites, we understand now, those who are now in power. On the plus side, closer to positive progressive populism, only a minority of the respondents would condition the support for a popular movement by its entrenchment into essentialism, ethno-religious traditions. 20 out of 107 respondents, all in all, stressed the importance of ethno-religious tradition. On the plus side also, numerous interviewees would rather back a Pan-African people's movement, something that goes beyond, I quote, our current artificial frontiers, in order to liberate and transform Africa. So it means that the national framework is not necessarily the one blocking the emergence of this more universalistic populist emancipatory movement. On the minus side, nevertheless, many participants do believe that, I quote, for fighting against the rotten system, we need to restore our way of living, our faith, our customs. So there is nevertheless an element of regression in terms of the projection of ideal type of essentialized community. Then some respondents also believe that democracy is not for the Africans. And so we need decades of strong leadership, order, discipline, I quote, enforced by a patriotic guide in order to guarantee the freedom of that African people. And also on the minus side, some participants think that everything is worth to get rid of the colonial or neo-colonial oppressors. Even as Malian said, we need the support of Russia for that. So an opening towards another kind of foreign interference that could, of course, deliberalize the essence of this populist movement. And so to end with is progressive populism possible? Well, it is difficult, but not impossible. It's possible provided that several conditions are met. First, that the attempts of manipulation by the liberal powers who are trying to establish an alternative kind of neocolonialism over the African states, and here, of course, Russia is the first, are really contained. Then, provided that the former colonial powers fully admit, do not make a mockery or a show of it, but fully admit their historical responsibility, and then instead of speaking, support in a quite effective and unbiased way the development projects currently present on the ground. And then provided that the progressive liberal democratic principles of these opposition leaders are combined with a clear set of socio-economic, popular and legitimate demands, and I would stress legitimate demands as they should arrive via deliberation from the people and not from the projection of some elites. Provided that the authenticity of the demands is also guaranteed by the profiles of the progressive populist leaders who make this could make sense, and this is the case of Bassirou in Senegal and his very modest and natural, I would say, condition. And finally, provided that reconciliation and tolerance become essential, and these are without any doubt, two important conditions, but not on the expenses of radical reforms, because otherwise we'll turn in a circle and we will go back to the previous kind of very polarized regime. So if these conditions are met, I would stress that according to this research, there are chances for progressive populist platforms in Africa. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor. Yes. So I will go back to Professor Nyitioseh. She's now here and ready. Professor, do you have a PowerPoint that you would like to use, or you are just going to speak? Professor, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I have network issues. I have a PowerPoint that I will use.
Okay. All right. So whenever you're ready.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Just 15 minutes. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you. You can start whenever you're ready. Maybe let me have one of our hosts, Neo, someone try and help her offline, and then we'll just go to the next speaker for now. Is that okay? Maybe check in with her offline, and then we will jump straight right now to, if you are ready, Professor Eduardo Yogo, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so I will go ahead and introduce you. Professor Yogo is a political scientist specializing in international relations and strategic studies at the University of Ude. He also teaches at military academies in Cameroon, including the War School, the Staff College in Ude, the Gendarmerie Officers School, and the Center for Advanced Techniques in Law Enforcement. With 10 scholarly books and over 30 scientific articles to his name, Dr. Yogo is a prominent scholar in his field. Through his teaching, research, and extensive consultations with the United Nations system, he is dedicated to enriching academic, military, international arenas with valuable perspectives and insights into political science and international relations. Today, Professor Yogo will give his talk on, populism and the challenges of democratic governance in Africa. Thank you, Dr. Edward Epiphan Yogo, for joining us. You can start whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much first of all, for accepting me to be part of this panel. And I would like also to thank you for the kind words towards me. It's a pleasure for me to be around all the various famous scholars that we have here, and I want to greet everybody being present here. Well, I have to discuss on populism and the challenges of democratic governance in Africa. In order to do that, we are going to, first of all, try to understand populism in the context of Africa, and then have a glance on the consequences and which responses can be implemented to it. First, we have to understand that Africa's political landscape has been marked by various challenges, including governance and socio-economic disparities. And in recent years, for instance, it has been noticeable in a rise of populism across the continent, characterized by charismatic leaders leveraging popular grievances to gain power. If we need to give a definition to populism, what one can understand it as a political approach that emphasizes the interests and needs of the common people against those of established elites or perceived outsiders. And generally, it involves charismatic leaders employing rhetoric that appeals to emotions or identities rather than rational policy solutions. And the main statement that we want to defend here is that the rise of populism, first of all, is evident in Africa. And in Africa, it presents profound challenges to democratic governance. These challenges include the erosion of institutional checks and balances, the polarization of political discourse, and threats to the rule of law and human rights. Therefore, some answers must be addressed to these challenges, the challenges raised by the rise of populism in Africa. We have also to mention that if you want to understand the etiology of populism in Africa, we must know that several economics and historical factors contribute to the rise of populism in Africa. Persistent inequality, both economic and social, they create fertile grounds for populist rhetoric and exploits a grievance among marginalized population. There is also rampant corruption, which undermines trust in traditional political institutions, leading people to seek alternative leaders who promise to root out corruption. You know, it's a question of confidence and mistrust. So if populism has to be fought by creating a state of confidence, that is fighting mistrust within the political sphere. Examining prominent populist leaders in Africa reveals common mobilization strategies to contribute to their success. They often employ a nationalist rhetoric that emphasizes national pride and sovereignty, tapping into sentiments or patriotics to garner support. They also capitalize on anti-elite rhetorics portraying themselves as champions of people against corrupt or out-touch political elites. Furthermore, populist leaders in Africa frequently make promises of simple solutions to complex issues. Some key African populists that we can cite here, Julius Malema, who used known for his fiery rhetoric and advocacy for economic redistribution, or Museveni in Uganda, who initially came to power with populist promises, although he finally faced criticism for authoritarian tendencies. Populist movements and leaders can vary widely in ideologies and methods, but they often appeal to grievances and frustration of marginalized or disaffected groups by promising radical change and challenging established political elites. The consequences that we can draw from of populism on democratic governance, first of all, is the weakening of democratic institutions. In fact, I think I would rather write weakening consolidating the weakness of democratic institutions. Populism can undermine democratic institutions by weakening the separation of powers, which is essential for maintaining check balances with democratic systems. Populist leaders may attempt to consolidate power by undermining the independence of the judiciary, sidelining legislative bodies, and concentrating authority in the executive branch. Additionally, populist governments often target independent media outlets, seeking to support dissenting voices and control the flow of information. This erosion of democratic norms as institution can lead to the erosion of accountability and the concentration of power in the hands of a single leader. Another consequence is the political polarization and social fragmentation, in terms of tending to exacerbate political polarization and social fragmentation by framing political discourse in terms of us versus them. Populist leaders often appeal to a narrow segment of population, fostering divisions along ethnic, religious, or regional lines. This polarization can lead to social unrest, hinder consensus building, and impede effective governance. Furthermore, heightened tensions between different groups within society can undermine social cohesion and contribute to instability. The third and last consequence that we can raise is the impact on the rule of law and human rights. Populist regime pose significant threats to the rule of law and human rights. In efforts to consolidate power, silent dissent, populist leaders may resort to repressive tactics such as arbitrary detention of political opponents, censorship of the media, and restriction of freedom of expression. The African context and examples and illustration are abundant as far as this part is concerned. Furthermore, populist government may weaken or circumvent legal mechanisms designed to protect human rights, leading to abuses of power and violation of civil liberties. The erosion of the rule of law and human rights under populist regimes undermine democratic principles and undermines the foundations of a free and just society. Some responses, therefore, could be addressed by strengthening, for instance, the democratic institutions and consolidating inclusive governance. This is essential because it helps to promote the separation of powers, ensuring that each branch of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, operates independently and serve as a check on the others. Judicial independence also is crucial to uphold the rule of law and ensure impartial justice. Additionally, protecting civil liberties, including freedom of speech, assembly, and association, is vital for safeguarding democratic principles and fostering an inclusive political environment where all citizens can participate freely. Another point is also to promote transparency and accountability. These are essential pillars for democratic governance, and government should prioritize measures to increase them. Implementing robust accountability mechanisms such as oversight bodies and whistleblower protection can help to protect to prevent corruption and hold public officials accountable for their actions. By promoting these two elements, government can rebuild citizens' trust and strengthen democratic institutions. Because what we have to know is that if we must insist on trust. Trust is very fundamental for a democratic space to be consolidated, to be effective. Combating misinformation and political manipulation too is another proposition, because in today's digital age, combating this phenomenon is a paramount strategy to safeguard the integrity of democratic processes. So it's important for government to invest in promoting media literacy and critical thinking skills to empower citizens to discern fact from fiction and resist manipulation. Additionally, enhancing media regulation to ensure accuracy, impartiality, and ethical standards in journalism can help to counter the spread of misinformation and promote informed public. Therefore, we must note that collaborative efforts between government, civil society, and tech companies are essential to effective combating misinformation and preventing the integrity of democratic elections and public discourse. There is also the need to encourage citizen participation and political education. This can be done by fostering a culture of civic engagement and democratic participation. So to conclude, what we have to keep in mind is that it is evident that populism poses significant challenges to democratic governance in Africa, because it threatens the foundation of democracy and jeopardizes the rights, freedom of citizens. Therefore, there is an urgent need for action to preserve democracy and strengthen democratic institutions in the face of populism. Governments, civil society organizations, and citizens alike must work together to uphold democratic principles, protect human rights, and promote inclusive governance. By resisting to authoritarian tendencies, defending the rule of law, and fostering a culture of accountability and transparency, we can safeguard democracy and ensure a bright future for Africa. In terms of future perspective, it's essential to acknowledge the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead in the quest to strengthen democratic governance in Africa. While populism continues to pose threats to democracy, there are also opportunities for positive change and progresses. By investing in education, empowering civil society, and promoting democratic values, Africa can overcome the challenges posed by populism and build a more resilient and inclusive democracy. Moreover, regional and international cooperation can play a crucial role in supporting democratic transitions and consolidating democratic gains against the continent. Ultimately, the future of democracy in Africa depends on our collective commitment to upholding democratic principles and defending the rights and freedom of all citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yoga. We're already seeing a theme that is emerging where there is a tension between the desire to move towards more democratic governance, the understanding that populist politics has served a purpose in African politics, given the history of colonialism and the unique challenges that the continent faces, but also the ways that populism hinders democratic growth. But without further ado, I think Professor Nchofua is back, and so I had already introduced you, so you can go ahead. And you are on mute, so if you can unmute, then we'll go right ahead.
You're still muted.
Okay, thank you for giving me the floor. I apologize for the late entry. I had network issues. So the topic under consideration is democratizing Africa, navigating populist trend, building trust in institutions, and promoting stability through inclusive governance. Our plan of work is going to look like this. We have the introduction, the causes of populism in Africa, ways to counter populism, promoting inclusive governance, an example of successes. It is important to note that Africans have a complex history with democracy. Why many countries strive to transcend over authoritarian rule, this process remains fragile. At this junction, it's important to define what democracy is all about. Democracy is defined by Britannica as a form of government in which a supreme power is vested on the people and exercised directly by them, by their elected agent under a free electoral system. Populism on its own part is a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. We are going to see the causes of populism in Africa. I will be talking on three major causes. That is the socio-economic inequality, the corruption, and youth employment. Talking on socio-economic inequality, it is evidence that the growing gap between the poor and the rich fuels hatred or resentment towards the established elite group. And one of these examples is the Gini coefficient, which shows a perfect inequality between income distribution. This Gini coefficient ranges from 0 to 1, 0 representing perfect equality, that is, everyone has the same income, and 1 representing perfect inequality, where one person has all the income, while everyone else has none. In South Africa, the Gini coefficient historically has been one of the highest in the world, indicating significant income inequalities. South African Gini coefficient was around 0.63 in 2009, in 2022, and remained same till date, reflecting substantial disparity in income distribution. Talking on corruption, we notice that rampant corruption weakens institutions and destroys public trust in Africa. One example is in Zimbabwe, where the Mugabe's regime corruption and mismanagement led to economic collapse, driving disappointment and paving way for populist movement. In Nigeria, widespread corruption among political elite has fueled support for populist figures like Buhari, who promised to tackle this corruption. Similarly, in South Africa, the ANC's corruption scandals under Jacob Zuma's presidency contributed to the rise of populist opposition parties like the Economic Freedom Fighters. Now, talking on youth unemployment, we notice that youth unemployment can indeed fuel populist movement in Africa, as disappointed young people may turn to charismatic leaders offering simple solutions. Populist leaders on their own part often exploit this frustration by simplifying complex issues. While they may initially appear responsive to citizens' concern, at first, their rhetoric can aggravate social division and undermine democratic institutions. One example is the rise of Julius Malema in South Africa, who gained popularity among unemployed youth by advocating for radical economic policies and land redistribution. In Nigeria, the Not Too Young to Run movement emerged partly as a response to high youth unemployment rates, reflecting a desire for political changes among young generation. Additionally, movements like the Flag in Zimbabwe, led by Pastor Evan, tapped into frustration with unemployment and government corruption, uniting support for change. Now we are going to look at the various ways in which we can counter this populism in Africa. One of the ways is strengthening the rule of law. Ensuring fair and impartial application of the law, regardless of social status, is vital. Countries like South Africa have undertaken constitutional reform to strengthen institutions and ensure that the rule of law is upheld. Liberia also put in efforts to reform its judiciary after civil war, and ensuring that the judiciary is free from political influence helps uphold the rule of law. Rwanda and Ghana, on their own part, implemented healthy anti-corruption measures, which are essential for promoting transparency and accountability, which are also key elements of the rule of law. Kenya has also witnessed vibrant civil society movement advocating for legal reforms and accountability, contributing to strong rule of law. It is important to note that many African countries have also partnered with international organizations and donors to strengthen the framework, improve access to justice, and build capacity within legal frameworks. The second way in which we can counter populism is combating corruption. A zero-tolerance approach to corruption with robust anti-corruption agency and independent media scrutiny is vital. Rwanda has been praised for its effort to combat corruption through a combination of strong leadership, institutional reforms, and anti-corruption legislation. The country has established specialized anti-corruption agencies and courts to investigate and prosecute corruption cases swiftly and effectively. Botswana, on its own part, has a reputation for being one of the Africa's least corrupt countries. Its success in combating corruption can be attributed to strong democratic institutions and a strong legal framework. Mauritius has also implemented a series of anti-corruption measures, including the establishment of Independent Commission Against Corruption, which is responsible for investigating and prosecuting corruption cases. Ghana has taken significant steps to combat corruption, including the passage of anti-corruption legislation and establishment of anti-corruption institutions such as Commission on Human Rights and Administrative Justice. Kenya has also made efforts to tackle corruption through establishment of institutions such as Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission. It is important to note that these examples highlight the diverse strategies that African countries have employed to combat corruption and promote good governance. However, it is worth noting that the effectiveness of these measures can vary, and corruption remains a significant challenge in many African countries. We are also going to look on how we can promote inclusive governance. First is by empowering civil society. Supporting civil society organizations strengthen democratic discourse and hold government accountable. One example is Ghana, which has implemented measures such as democratization to empower local communities, promote participation, and hold leaders accountable. Another example is Botswana, known for its stable democratic governance, where institutions are designed to include diverse voices and prevent the concentration of power. Additionally, South Africa has made strides to inclusive governance through mechanisms like Truth and Reconciliation Commission, aimed to address past injustice and fostering national unity. These efforts aim to address grievances and build trust between citizens and government, mitigating the appeals of populist movement. Decentralization. The devolution of power from central authorities to local level can indeed help combat populism in Africa by fostering more inclusive governance and empowering communities. One notable example is Kenya, which implemented decentralization reforms in the recent in early 2000, establishing county governments to divulge power and resources. This movement aimed to address historical marginalization and promote local participation in decision-making, reducing the appeal of populist movement by addressing grievances at the grassroots level. Another example is South Africa, where the post-apartheid government introduces decentralization measures to promote local democracies and service delivery, empowering municipalities to address the need for their communities and mitigate the influence of populist rhetoric. Another example is Ethiopia's federal system that grants autonomy to ethnic groups. Now, talking on investing on education, an educated community is better equipped to participate meaningfully in democratic processes. Rwanda has made significant investment in education, aiming to improve literacy rate and provide opportunities for its citizens. The government has implemented policies to increase access to education at all levels and enhance the quality of education. Ghana has been focusing on education as a key strategy for national development. Botswana, on its own part, has a long-standing commitment to education and has invested heavily in building schools and training teachers. South Africa has prioritized education as a means to address social disparity and promote inclusive growth. The government has implemented various programs to improve access to education and enhance the quality of teaching. Mr. Moderator, Mrs. Moderator, at this level, we are going to see successes of African countries towards democracy. It is important to note that despite challenges, there are positive examples of African countries making progress towards strong democracies. Few examples include Senegal. Senegal has a tradition of democracy with regular elections and a vibrant civil society. She witnessed a peaceful transfer of power in 2012 and recently in 2024, demonstrating the resilience of its democratic institution. Botswana, on its own part, known for long history of democratic rule, stable governance, and commitment to economic development. Also, Namibia held a peaceful and transparent election since independence, with strong civil society playing a vital role. South Africa, despite challenges, has a robust democratic system with regular elections and a strong emphasis on constitutionalism and the rule of law. Cape Town has a stable democratic government and has seen peaceful transition of power since gaining independence from Portugal in 1975. Mauritius has a stable democracy with regular elections, a free press, and an independent judiciary. While challenges remain in each of these countries, they demonstrate significant progress towards building and maintaining democratic institutions. To conclude, democratization in Africa is a continuous process. By addressing the root causes of populism, fostering trust in institutions, and promoting inclusive governance, African nations can build more stable and prosperous society. This, however, requires a concerted effort from government, civil society, and international partners to create an environment where all citizens feel empowered to participate and contribute to a brighter future. Thank you for your keen attention.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all our speakers for staying on time. You are an easy panel to moderate. Next up is Dr. Derek Vai Kenang from the University of Buea in Cameroon. Professor Vai is a political scientist, jurist, conflict resolution specialist, and crime expert specializing in human rights and economic intelligence with the Cameroon National Council for Crime Experts. He earned his PhD in International Relations and Conflict Resolution from the University of Buea. He's the founder and research lead of several organizations focusing on hate, crime, and diversity. Since 2020, he has served as the project associate for Defy Hate, for hashtag Defy Hate Now, an anti-hate speech campaign in Kenya, Uganda, and Sudan. Additionally, he's the founder of the Humanity for Peace, Education, and Digitalization, and co-founder of Civic Watch. With a keen interest in conflict of diversity, human rights violations, and war crimes, Dr. Fai works with a dynamic team dedicated to mitigating hate speech, incitement to violence, misinformation, and crime, both online and offline. Today, his talk is titled Populism, Discourse, and the Proliferation of Hate During Elections in Central African Sub-Region. Thank you, Dr. Derek Facets, for joining us, and whenever you're ready, sir.
Thank you so much, Madam the Moderator, for giving me the floor. Permit me to also thank the European Center for Populism Studies for making it possible for me to be part of this very interesting discourse. Like you rightly put it, I will be talking on populism discourse and the proliferation of hate during elections in Central African sub-region. And permit me to also steal some few seconds in my 10 minutes to say I am here to be a professor. I look forward to being that someday. I just defended my PhD of late. So just of recent. So if we might want to look at the discussions I'll be leading, I would just want us to have a very simple plan where we're going to have an introduction. We try to understand some concepts. We try to look at populism discourse through hate speech, and we go into the ramifications, and we take a conclusion, and if possible, come out with possible recommendations that we've produced. So at the level of the introduction, I would like to draw our attention to the fact that when it comes to issues related to populism discourse, we discover that populism is in reality something that has existed in Africa from time immemorial, and we've had different waves of populism in Africa. When we go by authors like Dendere, they make us understand we've had different waves of populism in Africa, and most especially in Sub-Saharan Africa. And if you look at these different waves, you understand that one of the most dangerous of them all was the waves that came in the early 1990s with the advent of multi-party politics in Africa. And with this, you discover there was a lot of populism discourse in the way people in their search to conquer and exercise power had to use populism discourse in order to get to power. Within this discourse, we thought it necessary not to focus on the actors nor the political parties engaged in this populism discourse, but rather to focus on the discussion in order to get an understanding as to how it usually takes place in most Sub-Saharan African countries, and most especially the Central African sub-region. We are talking about countries like Cameroon, we're talking about countries like Gabon, Chad, the Central African Republic. But I also thought it necessary that we create time to try to understand some few concepts. But to gain on time, I think I will just flip through. I would like to want to pick the definition of populism according to Jane Mansbridge and Stephen Macedo. They make us understand that populism is all about the people in a moral battle against the elites. I like that. And Lidad, in order to substantiate this, talked about populism being that which is all about representing the people and not the elites. So if we could understand populism from this standpoint, that battle of the moral battle by the people against those they consider the elite. And you want to ask yourself the question as per that wish to know. When the people use this moral battle, that is, when political leaders make the people to engage in a moral battle against elites, at times we find in this discourse what is referred to as hate speech. And by hate speech, I want to draw our attention to the fact that there is no universally accepted definition as of now We have researchers on board who can come in to clarify on that. But from my own standpoint, there is no universally accepted and agreeable definition as to what hate speech is all about, for obvious reasons. But I usually like to go with the definition that was given by the United Nations organization, which considers hate speech as any form of communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses pejorative and discriminative language with respect to someone's religion, ethnicity, color, distance, nationality. I usually just say background. So in my opinion, hate speech is any form of communication that attacks and discriminates or denigrates someone as a result of the individual's background. We can want to generally put it that way. And we might also want to understand the meaning of elections. And I like to always go by the definition of Ewang Sone, who considers elections as that mechanism by which power is given to certain individuals to govern the people. When we know that these are some of the things we're talking about populism discourse by trying to understand what populism is all about and how populism discourse in times of elections goes through the uses of hate speech. And we see it manifested. We want to look at how populism discourse uses hate speech or goes through hate speech in times of elections. You would like to do a study on presidential elections in countries like Cameroon. You would like to do a study on presidential elections in countries like Gabon, in countries like Chad, in countries like the Central African Republic, in countries like Nigeria, you name the rest. You discover that during this electoral period, during this period where the electoral calendar is being respected, there is that tendency of political populism being taken to its apex within the African context or within presidential elections in Africa. And these, they use it as a political strategy in order to conquer and exercise power. And by this political strategy, you discover that they coin populism inside another dangerous term, another dangerous form of discourse, which is that of hate speech. And you will find populists acting most often, like Ezebie will put it, ensuring that the political strategy they are using to gain power, it is that which passes through the power of the tongue, backed by hate speech in all elections. And how do they go about doing this? We're talking about the fact that populism discourse through hate speech will always, in most of these elections, go through the fanning of hateful cliches. You discover that the populists go into a kind of hateful cliche in which they use degrading words, they use discriminatory words towards their opponent, whom they qualify or they bring in the eyes of the masses, in the eyes of the people, as someone who is aimed at destroying them. And so they should give him the power so that he looks for a way to put an end to the quagmire that is about to befall them. We want to take concrete examples with presidential elections in some parts of Central Africa, like what we have or what we had in 2018 during the presidential elections in Cameroon, wherein the country was divided into two camps. You could either belong to what was called the Tontinat or you belong to what was called the Sardinat. You might want to also take a flip back into presidential elections in the Central African Republic during the reign after the reign of Catherine Samba Panza. You come across a situation in which hateful cliches were created across religious lines, and political populists had to use these hateful cliches in order to paint those they consider the elite black and gain power. It also goes through what is commonly referred to as ethno-tribal stereotypes. We are all conscious of the multicultural and diversified nature of the Central African sub-region. And so most often people fan the flames of ethnic divides and tribal divides by relying on existing stereotypes in these different ethnic and tribal groupings or communities to pass across populist discourse with the aim of taking and conquering power. And we also see them using hate speech through populism discourse through hate speech by trying to frame the political class that is existing at a given moment to be that class that is responsible for the downfall of the community. You will see this modus operandi in many elections especially with the case of Cameroon in the early 1990s, in the 2004 elections, in the 2011, the 2018 presidential elections. In the Central African Republic, you want to talk about the elections of 2015 and that of 2021. These and many examples are there to see in other countries. But you also want to agree with me that talking about populism, there is populism discourse in times of elections that passes through hate speech. It comes alongside with quite a number of ramifications, which is what I think it will be good we try to look at in this segment of the presentation. And by this, we are talking about ramifications that ranges from the destruction of social cohesion, fueling of tensions that can lead to armed conflict, and flaming of hate tendencies. You know, at times, the power of the tongue is just so powerful that you might want to think the tongue is more dangerous than bullets that we have. And by so doing, when hate tendencies are lying and sleeping, due to the fact that we are having a kind of calm environment, when a populist leader comes and wants to use hate discourse as a strategy to get to power, they go fanning those hate tendencies, and before you notice, the society is plagued by increased hate speeches around the place. They contribute in the destruction of social cohesion, like I already make mention, and you see all of this through these ramifications that I'm talking about. And with the ramifications that we've already noticed, knowing full well that when populism discourse that passes through hate speech, when it destroys social cohesion, when it fuels tensions that can lead to conflict, when it implants hate tendencies within communities, the possibility of us going into the dark continent, which is that of a full-blown armed conflict, is very, very high. And so we would like to end by providing certain recommendations that, in our own humble opinion, if taken into consideration, we might want to put an end to all of these. So we think there should be an increase in reforms to promote justice and strong institutions. And there should be that tendency of inculcating the democratic culture amongst African citizens and making them politically conscious, especially giving them a lot of knowledge in media and information literacy, and more specifically political communication that can permit them to distinguish between populist ideologies from democratic ideologies that are aimed at building and not destroying. We might want to increase efforts to ensure the reduction of poverty and promotion of sustainable development, so that when the people have what it takes to eat and what it takes to drink, have the minimum that humanity can provide, they will have that tendency of reasoning in the right direction. We want to build the capacity of a critical mass that can check the excesses of decision makers and politicians to make sure that the choices they make in terms of election is not based on hate rhetoric, but based on somebody that has a political program and balance sheet that ensures development and sustainable peace. With this, I would like to thank you people for giving me the floor and for listening to me. Thanks for your keen attention. I will be open to questions, suggestions, and conclusions should there be any. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Derek, for that amazing presentation. I'm back, meaning Dr. Dendere has left us, but she is still listening, which is fantastic. Our final speaker for today's panel is Dr. Nchofua, who will be speaking about the protection of female rights and the rise of populism in African democracies, a need for reformed society. Dr. Nchofua is a senior lecturer at the University of Cameroon, Faculty of Law and Political Science, at the Department of English Law. She is a specialist in maritime criminology and security in the Gulf of Guinea. Dr. Nchofua has obtained her PhD in English law at the University of Chang in 2019. She served as the interim dean at the School of Law and lecturer of maritime transportation and logistics at the National Polytechnic University of Bamenda, Cameroon, where she dispensed several courses at the postgraduate and undergraduate school. She supervises theses on maritime-related issues, politics and the rule of law, criminal law, human trafficking, property rights, employment law, international public law. He has also published widely on maritime security, policy, as well as the rule of law. Dr. Chipo, please take it away. You're currently muted, Doctor.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yeah.
Okay. I have done some research in the area of politics and the rule of law, and I definitely found the theme under consideration interesting. However, considering the crisis the female gender face in the African democracies affiliated with gender roles, I was motivated to much of my topic on the protection of female rights and the rights of populism in African democracies. In approaching my topic, I had to make my presentation into 4 main parts. The first part has to do with we deal with recognizing the rise of populism trend and its implications. The second part has to deal with recognizing the rule of law, democracy, and its implications. And the third part has to deal with the implication of the failure of democracy. While the last part, I have to highlight the necessity to for necessary reformations for a successful society. Now let's go with the definition of populism. The question is, what is populism? Well, it's a very nuanced definition. Populism at one end means something, and another end means something else. Well, but I had to approach a much more simpler approach in defining populism, which is the will of the people. Populism is all about public opinion, right? It's a kind of a system whereby the politicians or the political leaders tend to depend on the will of the people against their representatives. This gets what we call democracy. Democracy is and the law are intertwined, the democracy and the rule of law. And democracy is kind of a system of the law whereby the people, the population are given the opportunity to elect their government representatives to govern them. But however, the populists, however, turn to sideline the population towards them and makes the government representatives to appear corrupt set of people. And in effect, the population will have that tendency of not seeing the government representative they elected as their safe haven. The question that begs for an answer is, populism, is it legal, or does it have a legal backup? This could be somewhat controversial, but I would say that, well, it somehow has a legal backup because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights makes provision for the freedom of expression and opinion, which makes the populists tend to depend on this provision of Section 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to back up their rhetoric. And another question is, populism, does it benefit the society, or does it cause more harm to the society? Well, that's an opinion, the people's opinion, and the people's opinion could add more values to the society as well as could add the people's opinion could mar or destroy the society. It depends at the end of which it is being looked up to. But on the negative side, I would say populism weighs negatively on the rule of law, and the rule of law is what keeps the society in order. This will take us now to the next phase of our work, the next part of our work, which handles the rule of law, democracy, and the protection of female rights. Now, what is the rule of law? The rule of law is that system in the society whereby the society esteems that the state should have laws that govern the society, which makes the law supreme. And the rule of law has established another legal rule states that no one is above the law, which brings into play aspects like gender equality. This legal rule of no one is above the law has been incorporated in most constitutions in African democracies. The Constitution of Cameroon, for instance, affirms that. The Penal Code of Cameroon in Section 1 actually affirms incorporates this very vital rule of law of no one is above the law. No one is above the law. So, does the rule of law protect female rights? The answer is yes. The rule of law has protected female rights in African democracies. How has it protected female rights African democracies? There is, for instance, the Maputo Protocol. The Maputo Protocol has protected the females against early marriage, whereby it defines the minimum age of marriage for every girl. Because there's that populist tendency that in Africa that a woman's place is in the kitchen. A woman is not to have a voice. And definitely a man could pick up a woman just wherever, at whatever age, and marry that woman. So the Maputo Protocol came in to protect that aspect of the female in terms of marriage. It's equally protected of property rights, property inheritance. He has made provision for, he has protected women in areas of divorce. This has been supported by other international legal instruments such as the CEDAW Convention and in CEDAW Convention. But now you find that this is an aspect of the rule of law that protects female rights, which in Africa, some populist tendencies have come in to limit its application. I'll go back. In Africa, there's this general tendency that a woman is not supposed to have a voice. And that has affected the African woman in many ways. In most African settings, democracies, you find that you really have most women occupying positions in the parliament. When it comes to lawmaking, you have very few men occupying, maybe being leaders of political parties. Even in offices, you have those tendencies. I, for once, I was almost affected by the populist tendencies, whereby I was called to serve in the position of a dean, and I said no. I am a woman. I do have a male colleague in my department. Why not take him to occupy the position of a dean? And the vice chancellor was like, I don't understand what is happening with you women. And I told them that was because of the populist tendency that was arising in Africa, and it weighs on me. And that has limited the application of the laws. There is a provision in the Cameroon Penal Code. Now you have the Penal Code of 2016, but before the Penal Code of Cameroon of 2016, there was a provision in Section 361 on divorce and on divorce and adultery, under the grounds for adultery. And on this provision, a man could be sued under the grounds for adultery if only he was caught on his matrimonial bed. But the woman could be sued under the grounds for adultery where she was caught committing adultery wherever she could be committing the adultery. So there was this discrimination which gave rise to some kind of populist tendencies. And then you frequently find that Section 74 of the Civil Status Registration Ordinance equally deviates the provision of the Maputo Protocol, because under this section, it provides that a female can get into marriage at the age of 15. But under the Maputo Protocol, which is the regional convention, it is clear that by the age of 18. Why at all this? Why do we have these difficulties? Because of those populist tendencies in Africa that a woman is not supposed to have a voice. A woman is not supposed to give her opinion, and that weighs on the legal system, which has been put in order. We all know of the principle of separation of power. There is supposed to be a lawmaking body made of the legislative arm, which could make the laws, who could modify the laws, or could repeal the laws. They are equally permitted to table bills. And what is a bill? A bill is a law proposal. In a proposal, there is an opinion. The executive, made of member of government, are being empowered to enforce the laws. So definitely, you find that these populist tendencies are gearing towards rendering the rule of law obsolete, which can be possible in any democratic society. Now, this has some legal implications. We'll get to the implication of the failure of democracy. The failure of democracy will affect every lawmaking process. It will affect it negatively. It has social implications and it has economic implications. Now, I had to bring in a situation where we could the legal systems could maybe making some kind of reformation by reconciling, reconciling.
Okay. Just to make sure that's not my issue, you can also see and hear me, correct?
Yeah.
So Dr. Schiffer might be going through a technical difficulty. It looks like she is frozen. So in waiting, I propose the best thing to do would be, before offering for closing statements, we can move on to a brief Q&A session. While she either comes back online or she may not. So again, thank you to our speakers who have given just absolutely really thought-provoking talks. As a scholar who's studying African populism, it's been really interesting to see the different perspectives on the topic. It is, again, understudied. There is a huge bias towards populist manifestations in Latin America, in the Europes, and there's a growing litany in Asia, but South Africa is given little attention. So it's amazing to see scholars that, have given time, dedication, and attention to building African scholarship in the populist field. If you would like to ask a question to any of the speakers, please you either raise your hand or type into the chat box and one of the moderators will read it for you. Mr. Patrick, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for the lecture. It's been wonderful. I have a couple of, maybe let me just say 2 questions in order to give others time to ask to. The issue of populism is a topical issue and a very interesting one. But in the context of Africa, the idea behind populism here is your leaders listen to you and they hear from you so that they won't. Your leader tries to listen to you, get your own opinion about how you feel about issues of governance, how you are being led. And then there's always a cry against the establishment. But in Nigeria, for example, and I want to assume as it is in some other African countries, I don't really think we have this voice to make our leaders listen to us. Rather, we listen to our leaders. Their opinion and their views are forced on us. Not ours is not even considered. So if there is an element of progressive populism from what I've listened to from some people, I think in the context of Nigeria or some African countries, it's a little bit regressive. And I don't know why it is so. Because the voice is taken away from the people. The people are supposed to, ideally what populism is talking about is a moral battle against the elite or the establishment. But here we see a situation like during politics or electioneering campaign that the elites, these very elites are the ones that bite the ordinary people. These ordinary people that you think should have a voice are the ones that succumb to the gifts, petty gifts, material gifts, cash, and any other thing you can imagine to lure them during the election, in the face of electioneering. So there's a kind of feeling to me that you have already sold your rights. You have already given away that voice that should be listened to. So in a nutshell, is populism actual? Is it obtainable in Africa based on the little I have seen? Thank you.
Just to ask, is there a particular scholar you've posed the question to, or is it a free-for-all? Can anybody answer it?
Yeah, anybody can answer, but the last speaker and my colleague that just became a doctor from Cameroon, they spoke very well, but if they can answer, any other person is fine by me. Thank you.
So can any of the speakers who are interested in answering the question? Hi, Dr. Derek.
Yeah, maybe I come in. I will ask the panel, the speaker to just summarize the question again. My network, I lost him at some point when he was trying to pose the question. But I know it's touching on elections about people selling their rights. So please, can you just summarize the question again? Let me get you. I lost you at some point. Sorry.
Okay, sorry about that. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Of course. Yes, I can. Yes, I can hear you now. Thank you.
I said in African democracy, the rights that sometimes, almost times, our rights are being mortgaged. It's been sold. We the electorate sell these rights to our politicians. We sell them in terms of the gifts they offer us during electioneering, many petty gifts. And sometimes, again, these politicians can actually go ahead to steal the people's rights by way of manipulation and all this. So with this in mind, can we say the idea of populism in Africa is really obtainable? Because I'm making this assertion from the fact that we are not listened to. It is what they tell us we take. So with this in mind, can we actually say populism is progressive in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think if I should give an answer to your worry, it will be more of a debate of school of thought. But I want to go with the school of thought that strongly believes populism is present in Africa and it is gaining ground. If we might be facing a lot of difficulties to have populism actors or populism leaders in Africa, populism discourse, it's already very present, especially with the advent of multi-party politics. So I go with the fact that it is very present, and whether our rights are sold or not, or they steal these rights from us, it has become a very strong strategy that the people use to break emotions and to conquer, exercise, and maintain power. So in my opinion, you are very right when you say we sell our rights to them. That is simply because of the poverty nature of most African countries, in which we have a few that have amassed the resources for themselves and they can live very luxurious life, and they use divide and rule tendencies to ensure that the majority, that is the population, the masses, do not have what to even take as the basic needs that humanity provides. So when you are kept in a situation of abject poverty, any discourse that comes with the tendency of trying to show you a glimpse of hope is accepted. That is why one of the characteristics of populism discourse is that they unveil a kind of program to you that looks so great, but which in reality is not attainable. And why do they do that? They do that because they know, one, most Africans at times have mortgaged their rights. Some don't know out of ignorance. Some know because they are poor and they just want to eat something at the immediate situation of their hunger, sell those rights. And some, due to the poor electoral system that we have, these rights are taken away from us. Most African countries are yet to get to that level of democracy. Like it is often said, we only have two types of regime. Either you are a dictator or you are a democrat. You can be a totalitarian dictator or an authoritarian dictator. And we have so many authoritarian dictators in Africa that are clinking on power, and their opponents, in order to take power, see in populism the only way, the political strategy to go about it. So I don't know if I must have touched your worry somehow. Yes, populism is present in Africa, and it is gaining ground in our so-called democracy. I put it in quote, because we have more of authoritarian leaders than democratic leaders. That is why the discourse is even growing. That is why it is present in Africa, and it is both sides. Some suffer it because they are poor, and others suffer it because of the poor electoral system in which they sell their rights, and some suffer it because of the fact that these rights of theirs are taken away from them due to the bad system that we have. So you might want to see examples in Cameroon. You might want to see examples in the Central African Republic. You might go to Nigeria, close to us. You might go to Chad presently. You will see that if we don't have populism leaders in their numbers, the discourse has always been an existential reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Derek. 1 second. I saw a question from Mr. Julius. But before I give Mr. Julius the floor, Dr. Sergiu, are you raised your hand in response to the question, or is it an additional comment?
Yeah, it was in relation with the question, because it was about progressive populism, so it was in the topic of my presentation. It is just to stress the fact that once again, as Kinang Derek just said, the fact that there is a mechanism meant to reproduce the same elites in power and to transmit this power from father to son and so on is a mechanism that blocks alternation to power. And that's a reality in many countries. We discussed here several times about Cameroon. We know very well that from the early 80s, we have the same person in power controlling through clientelistical system the entire political realm. So because of this feature, the opposition, generic opposition, can very well participate in regular elections with quite modest results and with no prospect at all of gaining power. And that brings us to some generic solution, which could be denouncing the power itself based on a populist discourse. And of course, now, as this populist discourse is permanently marked by its own authoritarian and dictatorial penchants, the issue is how to remedy this in the opposition, how to provide such incentives, such strategies, such conditions also in order to create platforms that are closer to progressiveness and liberal democracy in the opposition. And nevertheless, we have some examples, and I sketched the example of the opposition in Senegal. Of course, it's not very specific in relation to other African systems, but still it's a good example under the circumstances where power was still there, also very much blocked by the elites, and the reproduction of the system was quite imminent. The response was a quasi, I would say, progressive populist opposition, producing alternation to power, so to a high extent manifesting democracy itself. So that's why I think that we as let's say scholars, but also as activists for democracy, we do have this objective. We should have this objective in mind: how to prevent these populist movements to go on the very dangerous slippery side towards dictatorships and rapprochement with very liberal powers, and how to fuel positive mechanisms of progressiveness in these in these movements? I think that could be my answer to the question.
Thank you, Dr. Sergiu. Mr. Julius, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a great opportunity for me to learn about populism. The first time I followed a course on populism was an online presentation by Professor Francis Fukuyama. And it was so interesting that I had to take down notes. Now, my question will be based on 3 points. Primarily, I'm a scholar who is interested in linking whatever thing happens to Africa to colonization. That's my base, to the point where I don't even believe states carved, formed, and designed out of colonization, those found in Africa, can really yield any positive result. Now, I will base my point on Professor Henning, Professor Sergiu, and Dr. Kinang Derek. Professor Henning said that populism is a worldwide phenomenon, which I agree. And I want to say that maybe it's peculiar when it comes to Africa, in the sense that, as Professor Sergiu put it, the struggle for independence was based on populism. And he talks about the new elites that were born out of colonization. And when we talk about new elites, we should know that there were old elites that formed the African state before colonization. So there was a conflict of elites. And even the African state itself was created on populism, the mission civilisatrice. That was a populist statement. There was nothing for Africans to be civilized about, but it was a catchword or a catch statement to subdue the people that, you have to accept what we are telling you. So it was a top-down dictate from Europe, not even from Africa. Now, let me end by talking on Dr. Eric Kinang. So I want to find out, because he talked about hate speech, which is what really divides the multi-ethnic nature of African states. He talks about, he mentioned some of them. I will add Anglophones in Cameroon call the Francophones frogs, and the Francophones will call the Anglophones Anglofou. You hear things like chop broke pots, that is those who eat today and forget about tomorrow. You hear about the Cam no-goes. Those are some of the hate speech coinages that animate the political arena of Cameroon. So, Dr. Kinang Derek, how can we link populism in Africa, in most of Africa, first to the creation of the colonial state, and secondly to the multi-ethnic groups or the quest for identity in most of our states? Thank you.
Okay, I don't know if the moderator can permit me to just step in and provide my answer before my co-panelists can chip in.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Julius, for that brilliant question, which is about linking hate speech to colonialism. I want to draw your attention to the fact that populism discourse that passes through hate speech has a direct link to the manner in which it is used in Africa. It has a direct link with colonial tendencies. You rightly brought up an example when you said in Cameroon, during elections, we had that tendency of the bilingual nature of the country coming to the forefront and people using it as hate speech. Wherein the Cameroonians of English expression are called Anglofous, while Cameroonians of French expression are called Francophous. It is as a result of their colonial history that this hate speech term came into existence. You see, those that were carved in what is today the northwest and the southwest region of Cameroon were under British rule, under British indirect rule. And those that are of French expression today were under French rule, which is of assimilation. And you discover that they came together in 1961 and created the Federal Republic of Cameroon, but not forgetting about their colonial background, especially the aspect of language. So you discover that there is that link with the hate speech tendency that you have in Cameroon and the historical colonial background that they have. You also want to take the aspect of imported constitutions. You discover that most of African constitutions, and specifically that of Cameroon as well, are tailored constitutions from European designed constitutions to answer to European realities than African realities that is based on heterogeneity and not homogeneity. You discover that our constitution is just a copy and paste model of different French Republic constitutions. And this same constitution has been responsible for hate speech tendencies used by populists in terms of elections. You want to hear of things like autochtones that is used in Cameroon in terms of election. Autochtones, it's an allogent, is something that is even found in the Cameroonian constitution. And when I'm talking about this, I'm not referring to the the English version of the constitution, but rather the French version, where you see terms like this appearing. Forgetting that Cameroon in particular and most African countries are multicultural and diversified in their nature. But unfortunately, we don't see this diversity as a strength. Many are using it as a weakness, and most political populists are also using it as a weakness. The reason why I said in my presentation that one of the elements they use to engage the populists in terms of elections through hate speech is what I refer to as ethno-tribal stereotypes, wherein they go into our diversity and they dig out some of the things that make us different, that makes us at times want to look at each other with some kind of animosity. They fan it to their advantage. So there is, to summarize, there is that link between African states and our colonial history, that tendency we have in our continent. And also, from the standpoint of your second question, in fact, from the second part of your question, that idea of identity, which is our multiculturalism, it is used negatively, though a positive thing, but it is used negatively most often by political populists through hate speech to come to power. I think that those are some of the contributions I might want to bring to your worry. And thank you so much for that brilliant question. I pass the floor back to the moderator.
Thank you, Dr. Derek. Is there anyone else who wants to take a stab at addressing Mr. Julius's question? Okay, I assume nobody else. Mr. Julius, I can see your mouth moving. I'm not sure if you're speaking to us because you're still muted. Okay, no. There is a question in the chat, which has been partially answered, but I'll read it here anyways. Salamawit asks, is there a difference between dictatorship and populism? Now, Dr. Melber has responding that dictatorship, that there is a difference, that dictatorship is a system, a governmental system, while populism is a form of policy. That dictatorships can be populist, but populism is not identical with dictatorship. And that there are populist forms of policy that are, also in democratic governments. Dr. Nyitioseh has also responded, stating that dictatorships involve centralized power with limited freedom, while populism relies on appealing to the interests of ordinary people against the perceived elites. So their journey is a clear difference. Populism, dictatorship typically relies on being an entrenched government, definitely limiting freedom. While populism it can be dictatorial, but it typically in most governments, most democracies. Dr. Bullet, I saw you had your hand up.
Yes, if it's not too late,
It is not.
I wonder about the interaction between populism and democratic movements in Africa and the populist or authoritarian tendencies in the globe overall or Europe. Is there any nexus or any connections or correlation between the trends in Africa and the global trends. Like, the people is expecting Donald Trump to come again, or Modi is maybe winning the elections in India. So how these kind of populist authoritarian tendencies take influence in Africa overall? Thank you. Maybe Professor Melber, Melbourne or Melber, yeah, and the other panelists could answer. Thank you very much. Or any panelist, I don't know.
Yeah, Professor Melber, please go ahead.
Thank you. I think one feature which is rather common in forms of populist policy is that it is highly personalized. That's a marked distinction to social movements, which are also at times very important political factors. Social movements act collectively. Populist movements or populist policy is highly personalized. So in most of the systems where we make reference to populism, we associate populism with specific protagonists of populism. And as the presentations this afternoon underlined, there was very often reference to specific persons when forms of populism were discussed. And populism at times borders to sectarianism. I think Trump is the classical case for that. And sectarianism can be very popular, and populism can be very popular. So it appeals to a lot of people. So it doesn't mean that if it's sectarian, that it's a tiny group. It has a very broad base at times. But if you look at the reasoning of those policy discourses, operating with fake news, operating with projections, and they are consumed and supported lock, stock, and barrel without reflecting, without analyzing, that points to the problem which Sergiu has actually made clear in his presentation when he asked the question for progressive forms of populism, that it's a very difficult challenge to establish progressive forms of populism, because unfortunately, populism is a means of policy making that tends to be reactionary. Very often we can see that populism goes hand in hand with homophobia or with xenophobia, or the example Sergiu gave, over-identification with other powers who back those populists, like as we see the Wagner Group or Russia or other forms where populists seize power based on the backing, which is not really ideological, it's more geostrategic when it comes to power politics. While other parties are basically making the distinction that they have a form of internal democracy. So in liberal democracies, the safest way against dictatorship, as was one of the questions, was that you have political parties with an internal democracy, and they discuss issues of the political program, and they appeal to the electorate based on political programs, which even party internally are a matter of debate. Now, that does not exclude that in vibrant democracies, there are not populist parties. South Africa, which I mentioned, is a very good example for that. Like others, former liberation movements, the ANC has very populist tendencies, but EFF and MK are even more populist. They are closer even to this negative reductionist image of being autocratic, reactionary populist movements. The difference to the ANC is the ANC has accepted a decline in its electoral support so far. The very interesting question will be what will happen end of the month if the ANC loses the absolute majority. That's an open question I don't dare to answer. It's a similar question when in November in Namibia elections are and SWAPO as the former liberation movement is under siege. But to make the point, populism can have very democratic forms in contrast to dictatorship, but it's very difficult to find populist democratic movements which are not in tendency reactionary or authoritarian.
Well, I have also a follow-up question in regard of this international interaction. I wonder very big about the role of China in Africa, across Africa. Is there any authoritarianism in Africa? Or backsliding of democratic qualifications in Africa. Could you say something about that?
Sergiu, is it okay if I quickly answer and then you come in? Okay, thanks. It's a very interesting question because with the geostrategic and economically motivated expansion of China into Africa, they were willing to take risks. They were investing in autocracies, in dictatorships. They moved into Sudan, where foreign direct investments from capitalist countries would be very reluctant. Zimbabwe was classical. They entered Zimbabwe at a time when the system was already totally isolated. But the moment Chinese investments achieved what they wanted, basically access to the local cake in terms of access to natural resources, they started to be very interested in the rule of law because they now had to protect their invested interests, their capitalist interests, basically, because the Chinese expansion into the African continent to a large extent reproduced the same exchange patterns as Western expansion into African societies. And the moment you have your foot in the door, you want to have relative stability. So you make risk investments to secure access. The moment this is successful, your agenda changes. Then you want to have rule of law, that your investment is safe. You want to have relative stability. And you could see that there came some tensions into the Chinese-Zimbabwean relations because of that. So in contrast, Wagner Group or Russia generally is not operating at the moment on the basis of making large foreign investments to generate profits through a form of exploitation within the given system. That is a far more rogue form of exploitation. They move in and in return they get some mines and they bring out this. It's a different system. And that goes much closer hand in hand with the dictatorships and the form of reactionary authoritarian populism they are backing up. I'm not sure if it's sufficient as an answer, but due to the time, I think I should stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor.
So if I may just very shortly complete the answer, I think Henning offered a very precise overview of what happened, and I'm coming back on the empirical side. I conducted another inquiry among regular African people about the perception of Russia and China through discussions, and it was precisely that impression that the research left. China was perceived like soft imperial power, while Russia was perceived and is still perceived as an aggressive power. But paradoxically, many respondents say that we need a more active way of dealing with the exploitation of the maleficent West and North. And this is why we should put our money on Russia rather than on China, because China is really much more calculated and less keen to go into conflicts. And as Professor Melber put it, China is a huge global investor and it needs long-term stability in order to progress in opening markets, pushing through businesses and so on, while Russia in this moment is interested in destabilization in order to show that it's not alone on in the world, and that new kind of Cold War can be really possible via these African states or other states in the world that will fight like in good old times between USSR and USA. That's more or less what results out of this inquiry, and that's why, yeah, indeed, progressive populism is limited, and it's more limited today than it was before. But I think that nevertheless we should leave a little bit open a part, half of a window, let's put it that way, because what is in stake is that democracy needs to be defended, and sometimes it needs to be defended in a very strong way, while the institutional systems are still very much clientelistic and close on themselves. So no hope from that side.
Okay, thank you, Professor Sergiu. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, and there is about 1 to 2 questions in the chat. The first is in French, and Dr. Sergiu has volunteered to answer it when it comes up. So thank you for that. The second, Franklin asks, can somebody help clarify that populism can fall under a form of instrumentalization during elections or referenda, yet it seems to gain praises in contemporary policies. So Franklin asks, can institutions or legislator play a role in circumventing or limiting the negative effect of populism on democracy? Or is it entirely the role of ethics in politics and our political actors? I assume this is open for anybody. We have 10 minutes before closing. So anybody who feels the need or that they can answer it, please hop on.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Oui. Moi, c'est Milimuno Idrissa. Je suis étudiant à l'université UBB de Cluj, c'est en Roumanie. J'ai une question par rapport au thème d'aujourd'hui, le populisme. Et lorsqu'on regarde l'Afrique, la montée en puissance de ce leader populiste, est-ce que l'on ne peut pas aussi se focaliser sur la mentalité même du peuple africain? Qu'est-ce que je veux dire par là? Lorsque vous prenez l'entièreté, bien sûr, de ces leaders populistes qui évoluent aujourd'hui en Afrique, ils se focalisent souvent sur le niveau intellectuel de la population pour pouvoir asseoir leur stratégie populiste. Est-ce que cela ne dépend pas aussi de la manière dont le peuple africain a la capacité de discernement, bien sûr, de la démocratie, mais aussi du populisme? Car souvent, ces leaders populistes se focalisent sur ce qui ne va pas au niveau du bas peuple pour asseoir leur pouvoir. Mais dès lors qu'ils sont au pouvoir acclamés par ce même peuple, ils se radicalisent totalement contre ce même peuple. Est-ce que l'on ne peut pas aussi se questionner par rapport à la mentalité même du peuple qui acclame dès l'introduction de ces leaders au niveau de notre continent africain?
If you want me, I can try to answer, but should I do it in French or in English?
I would love if you could in both, if you could summarize it in English, and then, but I'd love for you to answer him first, or really briefly, and then give a translation of his question, and then a quick one for us in English. That would be amazing. Thank you.
But I think he understands English.
Ah.
He can't speak English, so I will summarize. The question is about the level of education, mainly of the people, and the strategies of the parties in power to contain populism in relation with that. And but my answer, but I urge others also to try to answer this question, would be that this is very much dependent, not necessarily on the intellectual level of the people, because I really believe that if we settle this kind of obstacles related to the level of studies, we condition the people in function of that for the political activities, participation, and so on. We go back 5 centuries ago, and especially in Africa, this could mean that a very small portion of the population will be able to be politically active. And I don't think that this is at all the solution. The solution is elsewhere, is in the democratic practice. Once again, the examples maybe of Benin, but also Senegal, especially, where because of the practices of alternation that were repeated during the last 30 years, there was collective consciousness that prevented the confiscation of power by the elites, with or without the populist discourse. And that's why an anti-governmental, somehow progressive populist discourse was able to be framed. This doesn't come all of a sudden. This comes with the democratic experience, and this comes with the elections, regularly organized elections in better conditions than in other parts. So that's why the system has an important duty to be aware of the need to create these conditions of possibility for the democratic practice, and that could also orient even the populist movements in the opposition towards much more, let's say, less liberal, less radical, in the bad sense of the word, ideas and actions.
Thank you, Dr. Mischel.
Hello, Neo.
Hi, Gabriel.
Yeah, it's Derek. Maybe I want to attempt an answer to. There is a question on the chat box that is talking about whether we can circumvent political populism through legislation or political ethics. There's a question there. I think that it touches my presentation. And I want to just briefly say, we would not want to give the legislator that possibility to do so, because those in charge of the state machinery might just use it as an avenue to suppress free speech. So in my opinion, I strongly believe most countries within their electoral laws, they already have the do's and don'ts in times of elections. That is the kind of language you are not expected to use in times of elections. And by so doing, populism is just that policy and mechanism strategy that they come to use, not necessarily violating existing legislations on elections, but fanning the flames of the mass, the emotions of the mass, to have them, bring them to power against the elite. So in my point of view, I will follow the part of Professor Henning by simply saying it is all about ethical political behavior that we need to inculcate amongst all those who engage in power, and most especially educating the masses for them to make a distinction between a political program that is useful and discourse in terms of elections that is just purely populist discourse that is coming from politicians that will not in any way meet the aspirations of the masses. So I think it is all more about ethical politicking, in which the masses are taught to make a distinction between a program that is realizable and helpful to them over a program from a political populist? Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Gabriel, I see your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Neo. I would like to thank all the speakers and congratulate them for your interesting presentations. So I have one or two questions. The first question is about, I would like to know the role or the link between the great powers or external powers competition in Africa and the rise of populist movements in Africa. You know, populism, as some of the speakers said, it is a rising phenomenon in Africa. If not a rising phenomenon, it is changing its manifestations in Africa with the rise of new populist leaders, like we see the military populist leaders in some African countries, like in Burkina Faso and Mali, or even in Niger and other African countries. So what is the link? What is the link between great power competitions in Africa and the rise of populist movement on the African continent? And the other question is about the role of Pan-African network. What is the influence of Pan-African network in the rise of populist movement in Africa? And also, maybe if I can end with this third aspect of my question, of my preoccupation, is about the role of the African Union. How can the African Union, how can it play an important role in fighting against this rise of populist movement on the continent? What is the role? How can Africa? We know Africa. The African Union is the prominent actor, has a prominent actor in promoting democratic ideas or democracy simply in Africa. So how can African Union participate or contribute in preventing this rise of populism and populist movement on the continent? Thank you very much.
You are mute.
Okay, there I am. Thank you, Gabriel, for the question. Do any of the speakers have the ability to answer really before we wrap up?
I would just maybe answer the third question. Unfortunately, the African Union is really blocked in its initial project, and I think that the capacity of the African Union to influence in a positive sense by containing populism, by prompting liberal democracy, good governance, is very limited by the very fact that, let's be honest, in the leadership of the African Union, we've got lots of people practicing anti-liberal and populist policies. So we cannot expect very much from the African Union itself. On the other hand, to answer, and I will end here, the first question about Pan-Africanism, I think that the seeds of some elements of progressive populism can be found there. And I was astonished when meeting lots of respondents during my inquiries about the fact that they really, how to put it non-academically, they didn't give a damn about the frontiers as they are today. Lots of them said that they would prefer a much more transfrontalier kind of populist emancipatory movement that could lead to a real capacity of the African people to have a say in politics as opposed to what happens today. So, and this also reduces the possibility to slip towards racisms, xenophobia, and other such elements. So that's a part of the project that was repeatedly prompted and then abandoned, but it may contain the seeds of some emancipatory elements in order to regulate the actual situation that we have to admit that is not very bright more than 60 years after the independence of most African states.
Thank you, Dr. Sergiu. Okay, we have reaching the end of our panel. It's been absolutely fantastic. We are rejoined by Dr. Dendere, who will give a few short words. Pleasure to have you back. Please take it away.
Thank you, Neo. Thank you, everyone, for showing up and for staying with us as long as you have. If I were to summarize what we've had today, it is that the rise of populism is necessitated by root issues that are on the continent, poverty, income inequality. These are the issues that make it possible for politicians that come in with grandiose policies to fill in that gap, right? Because at its very heart, populism is about making individualized, particularized promises to particular groups within the society. And that is made possible when there are so many grievances, when there is clear income inequality, when there are very many poor people. And that's something that we're seeing coming up in the South African election, right? So I'm living in Cape Town, which is a paradox of a city. You have a lot of money, you have extreme poverty. And to attract voters on either side, politicians have to say things that are sometimes outlandish. But I also think that something really wonderful that's come out of this panel is reminding us that populism in some countries is existing or coexisting with democracy. And it is that the dangers of populism can be tempered by strong democratic culture, by strong democratic institutions. So in countries like South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Ghana, it is not that there is a lack of populist politics, but it is that there are other things. The constitution is strong, the institutions are strong, people's engagement with democracy is strong. And so when you have that, the problems that come with populism are not as grave as when you look at Uganda or Zimbabwe, in places where the political space is very, very small. And so there is nothing to curb the bad side or the bad actions of political actors. And so the regime in Zimbabwe, which is not very different from ANC in terms of their roots, can make outlandish promises, can create what I wrote down here is fictionalized enemies, right, to the people. But the economy is not doing well. The people live in fear. The judiciary is not free. The media is not free. That gives this populist rhetoric legs to grow faster, to go faster in a way that is more tempered in South Africa because other institutions work. It's not saying that the democracy in South Africa or in Kenya or in Ghana is where it should be, but it's saying that when some aspects of democracy work, like in Senegal, when some aspects of democracy work, then the other political problems are much, much easier to curb and control. But in countries, Cameroon, Zimbabwe, Uganda, there are many, many more problems for democracy that allow for autocratic rule to gain ground. So thank you to our panelists for well-prepared and well-thought-out remarks. You've given us a lot to think about, and we can't wait to read the publications that come out of your work. And thank you so much to ECPS for planning this and putting it together. And I have to note that this is also a panel that was very diverse and very representative of the global views that are studying African politics. So thank you so much for that work. Have a good evening, everyone, wherever you are.
And thank you, Dr. Oh, please don't leave. Thank you, Dr. Dendere, for your wonderful moderation. We've come to the end of the panel. Dear attendees, thank you so much for your questions, your time, really, really important, and your comments. It's really enriched the panel. And it's given our panelists, I hope, a lot to think about. I too am looking forward to hopefully publications from our panelists. But for the attendees, please mark your calendars for the 30th of May, where we have our next regional panel titled The Resurgence of Expansionism Tsarism, Populist Autocracy in Russia. As on the 30th of May, the link will be up on our website shortly. Again, we'll have this session recorded, uploaded onto our YouTube channel, and within the next week or two, we will publish the panel report from this channel. Thank you again for your time, your energy, your efforts. Have a lovely rest of the day and a lovely rest of the week. Thank you for being here. Goodbye.